John here from Great Lakes Country, and today we're making the creamiest, cheesiest, richest, most delicious spinach artichoke dip you've ever seen, along with some scratch-made corn tortilla chips. That's right, spinach artichoke dip, one of my all-time favorite party appetizers, hors d'oeuvres. What do you call the food on a big table at a party? Appetizers? Finger foods? I don't know, what's the proper name for that? I don't know. In any case, when we're talking about creamy, cheesy, warm, amazing dips, spinach artichoke is definitely at the top of my list. And in this video, we're gonna be making exactly that. And no, we're not gonna be dropping a brick of cream cheese into a pot of cream of nasty soup and pretending that it's cooking. We're gonna be doing it the real way, with a simple roux using actual cream. And if that didn't already sound amazing enough, we're also gonna be making some beautiful homemade corn tortilla chips, 100% from scratch. No, you don't need to make the tortilla chips yourself. You can certainly buy a bag of them. But I think they're fun to make, and you really can't beat some wonderful, warm, crispy, crunchy homemade tortillas. So enough of the intro, let's get right into it and start making this spinach artichoke dip. And to get started, we have to do just a little bit of prep work, starting with some yellow onion. And we only need about 2 tablespoons of this onion, which will be something in the neighborhood of maybe a quarter of this thing. And I am going to do a pretty fine chop on this, maybe not quite a mince, but I want it to be definitely on the small side for my little onion pieces here. And something like that. That's probably a little bit more than 2 tablespoons, but that's all right. That's gonna work out perfectly. Next, we need a couple of cloves of garlic. We'll just get these peeled up and we're mincing. Or use your garlic press or buy the little containers of pre-minced garlic that's floating in liquid. Any of it's gonna work. We just need a little bit of garlic in this. Next, we need our artichoke hearts, and this batch calls for 1 12-ounce jar of artichoke hearts, and I'm using the kind that don't say marinated artichoke hearts. These are just quartered artichoke hearts in water. This is the brand my store has. Doesn't really matter which one you use, but you really don't want to get the ones that say marinated, because that's going to incorporate a bunch of other oils and flavors in there that aren't necessarily in line with the dish we're trying to make. And these are already quartered, but I want to chop them up a little finer, make them more like little bits and shreds rather than these hunks. So we'll just go through and give it a rough chop with the chef knife. Something about like that. And this wouldn't be much of a spinach artichoke dip without the spinach. And I know what you're thinking, this is an absolute ton of spinach, and yes, that's true. Couldn't I just use frozen spinach? Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's what most of these recipes call for, because it's just easier. But you know me, and I seem to like to do things in pretty much the hardest way possible. And the store had a ton of this fresh baby spinach on sale because it's gotta be sold within the next couple days. But it looks good, it looks perfectly nice, so I'm gonna use it. How could fresh spinach not make everything even better? Now, I don't necessarily want all of these bigger stems in my spinach artichoke dip, so I am gonna go through and just pluck any of these larger pieces of stem right off of there. Yes, of course, this is gonna be tedious, but you know what? It's not that much worse than if I'd used frozen, because with frozen, you gotta thaw it out, then you gotta strain it, then you gotta squeeze it out through a colander or with a towel, getting your towel all green and yucky. Because for a recipe like this, you want that spinach completely as dry as possible, totally strained, totally squeezed. And yes, I did have to wash all of this fresh spinach, but after that, it's just a quick little spin around the salad spinner, and it's sufficiently dry. Anyway, this batch of dip calls for 2 10-ounce packages of frozen spinach, or in my case, the equivalent to that in fresh spinach is 2 pounds. So yeah, that's a lot of fresh spinach. You know, as soon as it gets on that heat, it's gonna wilt down into practically nothing, but in its raw form, it sure looks like a lot, and it sure takes up a lot of space. Anyway, I'll go through and pick all the larger stems off of every one of these little spinach leaves. Probably gonna take me about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll pick it up, move on to the next step. All right, spinach is ready to go, and I'll admit that by the end of that, I was definitely getting a little bit less discerning about which stems I picked and didn't, because, man, that starts to get pretty tedious. And something I nearly forgot was that we gotta give this spinach a bit of a chop. We don't want our dip having full spinach leaves in there stuck to a tortilla chip, so we do need to chop all of this. We don't have to go crazy, we just gotta give it a once or twice over. Next up, we gotta grate some cheese. This dip calls for 2 different kinds of cheese. We got some nice Pecorino Romano right here and some white cheddar here. Now, the Pecorino Romano is gonna be going into the dip. The white cheddar's really more for sprinkling on top. Once it's served, get nice and melty, create a little top layer of cheese there. As for the Pecorino, we need 1/3 of a cup of that. And the cheddar, and how much of this we need will really depend on the diameter of the vessel that we're serving it in. I'll just shred up about 1/2 cup of it. I'm sure that'll be plenty. Now we're finally ready to start cooking. So I've got my burner here, turned to about, we'll call that medium-high heat. And I've got my big Enamel Dutch oven. You could use a very large saucepan or something like that. The Dutch oven works tremendously well. And into that, I'll get a 1/4 cup of butter melting. And once that's all melted, in go my couple of tablespoons of finely chopped onion. And we'll just give those a quick saute for a couple minutes. And then we'll add in that minced garlic and cook about another 1 minute. Now we're sprinkling over a 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour because, of course, now we have to make a roux. And I'll just get that flour all whisked into that butter and onions and garlic until it gets nice and thick. And I'll just let that all cook for 1 entire minute. Now to start whisking in our liquids, starting with a 1/4 cup of chicken broth. And now's when this roux's really gonna start thickening up into a paste. And now we'll start gradually adding our heavy cream. We're adding in 2 cups, and I'll just do a little bit at a time so as to not let anything get clumpy. Just pour some in, whisk, pour, whisk, and repeat. And once we got all that cream whisked in, I'll reduce my heat to about medium. And now we have to let this whole mixture come up to a very gentle, low boil. And once this mixture starts bubbling just a little bit, we can add in most of the rest of our ingredients, starting with 2 teaspoons of lemon juice, a 1/2 teaspoon of hot sauce, whatever kind you like. This is Frank's Red Hot. Doesn't make it spicy, just adds a little zip. And a 1/2 teaspoon of kosher salt. Give that all a quick stir. And now we can start incorporating our Pecorino Romano cheese. Just do about a big pinch at a time. Get it stirred in. And do the rest. Stir that in. And we're just gonna let this all sit for, 3 or 5 minutes. Just make sure all that cheese is completely melted in there. Now we can finally start folding in our artichokes. Now I'm adding in that chopped spinach. I'm gonna just do a little bit at a time because it's gonna end up taking up a ton of space in that Dutch oven. So I'll just do a handful at a time, let it start wilting down, and I've got the heat turned down to, I guess I'd say about medium. We don't really need heat anymore at this point for the sauce component of this, but we do need some heat to make sure that spinach can wilt. So I'll just keep folding it in, drop a handful at a time, fold it, stir it, cook it, and I guess we can jump ahead a couple minutes to when that spinach is all in there. Okay, we've got all that spinach folded in, and right now there's only one more ingredient we have to stir in, and that's about a 1/4 cup of some sour cream. Just gonna make everything a little creamier, a little more luxurious, a little more delicious. Not that it was lacking on flavor to begin with, but we're making the ultimate spinach artichoke dip. And that sour cream is just gonna bring a little something extra to it. Now our dip is practically finished. I am just gonna leave it with the heat off in this pot for just a little while. Let it start to cool down a little bit before I transfer it into something else. And in that time, it'll thicken up just a little bit more and ultimately becoming the perfect dip consistency. And because that spinach artichoke dip seemed almost too easy, well, now it just seems downright reasonable that we make these tortilla chips completely from scratch. So for our corn tortillas, we need to start with some of this stuff that's called masa harina, also known as instant masa corn flour. You really want to get the right stuff if you're going to make corn tortillas from scratch, and you can pretty much get it at any grocery store. So we'll start by putting a cup of that masa harina into a bowl, along with some salt, about half a teaspoon. I'll give that salt and masa a preliminary mix with a fork. And then to it, I'll add 3/4 of a cup of some water that's been heated to 125 degrees, which is pretty much as hot as my tap will get the water. Then I'll just start mixing and folding that dry into that wet till it all kind of comes together into sort of a dough. Then I'll turn all of that onto the counter and just kind of knead it for another, I don't know, let's call it a minute, just to make sure all that moisture is distributed throughout all of the dry. The whole thing's coming together. That masa is hydrating nicely. Just kind of form the whole thing up into a bit of a ball. Something about like that. Now from here on out, it's gonna be important to keep whatever dough you're not working with covered with some plastic or something. So I'm just gonna throw my little dough ball right back here into this mixing bowl, and I'll just keep the whole thing covered with a lightly damp kitchen towel when I'm not actively needing to access that dough ball. Next, we need to start pressing that dough out into some individual tortillas. And for that, I'm gonna be using my trusty cast iron tortilla press. You could absolutely do this part with a rolling pin, but it's gonna make it so much easier and make your tortillas much more consistent if you've got a cheap tortilla press like this. So I'm gonna do only one of these at a time, just because I wanna keep the rest of that dough ball nice and covered with that towel. And I'll use my kitchen scale here and measure out a 1.5 ounce little piece of this dough, which is about that much. And I'll get that squished and rolled up into a pretty nice, smooth little ball. Doesn't have to be too perfectly symmetrical, just something like that. And to use this tortilla press, I'll get it opened up and then lay in a sheet of this parchment paper, this non-stick waxy paper, which actually came with this tortilla press. A big old package of it came. Alternatively, some people take like a Ziploc bag and cut a circle out of it and just use that. But this works well. So in goes my little dough ball, and I'll cover it with a second piece of that waxy paper. Then start closing the lid. Get this handle over here and just press. And there we have my first pressed out tortilla. Now I've got my burner back out, and we're gonna get the flame set to about medium-high heat and just start heating up a good cast iron skillet. Fun fact, this is actually a Wagnerware skillet that I completely restored that I found at a vintage shop for about $10. If you can ever get your hands on some really old cast iron cookware, I can't recommend it highly enough if you're into cast iron cooking. Back in the day, I'm talking early 1900s, they made cast iron skillets to be much more smooth than all of the modern stuff you see like Lodge. And once that pan's pretty hot, we're going to carefully peel off this paper, laying the tortilla across our hand. And then that tortilla is just going right into the skillet. And of course, I couldn't have done that in a way where it laid flat because I had to try to show off. It's all right, it's gonna be fine. Don't wanna mess with it yet till it's had a minute to cook in there. And once it's been in there for about 45 to 60 seconds and it starts to move pretty freely on the pan, we'll just give it a flip. Do the same to the other side. And as each tortilla is finished cooking, I will transfer them into my little tortilla warmer here. Because as they sit in here all nice and hot, they're going to get even better and more pliable and delicious. So the name of the game is pretty much keeping everything covered. The tortillas after you've cooked them, the ball of dough before you've had a chance to work on them. Keep that dough from drying out before it's cooked and keep it from getting cold after it's cooked. So now I'll just repeat until I've made a whole bunch of these tortillas, and then we can move on and actually start turning them into some tortilla chips. All right, we're finally ready to turn these corn tortillas into some corn tortilla chips. And to do that, it's pretty simple. First, I'll make sure that my tortillas are all nicely stacked up because I'm going to be cutting them into some wedge shapes. Something about like that looks pretty good. And these are kind of small tortillas, so I think cutting them into quarters is going to be perfect. Hey, doesn't that look nice? Now we just got to fry these in some oil. So here I've got one of my cast iron Dutch ovens filled with some vegetable oil. Any kind of high smoke point oil like vegetable or canola is going to work great. I've got about 3 inches of oil in this Dutch oven, but I do like to leave plenty of space above the oil just in case there's any spattering or bubbling when I start frying these tortillas. I've got the oil heated up to 350 degrees, and I'm just going to start setting in my little tortilla triangles. I'll only do a few at a time because I don't want to overcrowd the pan, bring the temperature of the oil down too much. And we'll just let those fry away for a couple minutes until they harden up and become beautifully crispy, lightly browned. And as the moisture inside of those little tortillas start to fry out, they're gonna make all sorts of crazy sounds. Just keep them moved around a little bit. Make sure they got good oil exposure all over. None of them are gonna stick to one another. Really just takes a couple of minutes. And when they look about like that, they're done. So I'll transfer them out onto a wire rack so they can drip if they need to. And right away, while they're still glistening, I'll hit them with a little bit of kosher salt because you gotta have a salty tortilla chip. Now I'll just repeat with the rest of my little tortilla wedges and our chips will be done. Now, as for how to serve this spinach artichoke dip, if I was making this stuff to take to a party or some kind of celebration, I would put it in one of these small crock pot warmers like this. Then I'd sprinkle that shredded cheddar cheese over top and then put the lid on and just let the heat of this warmer take care of melting that cheese on top. It's not gonna make it as golden brown and bubbly and beautiful as it could be, which is why if I intend to serve this dip right away, I'm instead gonna put it into something like this. A cast iron skillet, a big cast iron platter, or what I think works tremendously well, my cast iron pie pan. And that's because this is gonna be going into the oven for just a little while to get this shredded cheddar cheese melty and beautiful. So now is when I'll sprinkle that cheese over top, doing my best to distribute it nice and evenly across. We don't need to go too crazy with the cheese. It's already got a lot of that pecorino romano in there, which is pretty salty. We don't necessarily need to add, 2-inch thick layer of this cheese on top. Just enough to give it a little something extra and make it look bubbly and beautiful when we pull it out of the oven. So now this whole pan is going under the broiler for just, 3, 4, 5 minutes until all that cheese is melted and starting to look a little brown. And there we have it, cheesy, delicious, homemade spinach artichoke dip. And the crispiest, crunchiest, scratch-made corn tortilla chips. If that's not a hors d'oeuvre or appetizer you'd want to dig right into, I don't know what is. Now, finally, I think it's time to grab a chip and have a bite. Did you hear the crunch on that chip? That's what I'm talking about. Perfectly salty, perfectly creamy, perfectly cheesy. If you're into spinach artichoke dip, you owe it to yourself to try this one out. And if you've never had it, but you're a fan of creamy dips and spinach, then there's no way you're not gonna like this. And I probably should have checked my teeth for spinach after eating that on camera. But the heck with it, we'll do a live. Anyway, as always, if you want to try making this spinach artichoke dip, I'll have a link in the video description below to the entire written out recipe for everything. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including, of course, future cooking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.